Hello? Does this thing work? This is the Peak Boredom Podcast.
1, 2, 3.
Hi, welcome to Peak Boredom! Yay! Today we have Andini.
Woo!
I met her when I was a fresh graduate from high school and I was in an internship and she was really cool and I'm glad to have her back now.
Woo!
So do you want to introduce yourself a bit? Just a bit of context.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Marisa and Michelle, for having me in your podcast. Very happy to be here. So I'm Andini, and I've been working as a researcher in monitoring and evaluation, mostly for development projects. And these are usually projects in governance, in improving basic service delivery in health, education, and social protection services. Yeah, well, basically, that's a little bit about me.
Woo! So can you tell us a bit about how you ended up where you are? Like, what made you want to pursue the path of a researcher?
So this went back with when I was in undergrad. I was doing my Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Melbourne, thinking that I wanted to be a medical doctor. I actually wanted to be a forensic doctor, thinking about that a lot.
Wow.
Until my last year in undergrad, thinking that, hang on, there is actually something a bit bigger than this, like just being a doctor. And this came from my experience just living here in Jakarta and around my house, where I get to see some of my neighbors who are less fortunate, who keep asking to borrow money from my mom whenever they have issues like health issues or just any other issues in life in general. And then it got me thinking, why are they not receiving the help that they should be receiving when they are actually categorized as people who should be receiving help from the government? And it's not only about health, but in general, social safety net. And then I thought to myself, there has to be something a bit bigger than just something wrong in the data or something. Like, this is not the only case that I saw at the time. And I kept hearing about these kinds of cases in the news, and this is happening all across Indonesia. And then that's when I started thinking that this was actually a systemic problem, that something is just wrong in the system when it's not, services is not reaching people when they should be receiving them. And then after that, I did a lot of thinking, and then I realized that my passion was actually in understanding how the system worked in the service provision sector. At the time, I was really interested in health. So after completing my undergrad, I went on to do my master's in public health in Boston University. So I did that for 1.5 years. And then even there at school, I realized that I was really interested in health system strengthening, particularly from the governance side of things, because that's an area where that is not really explored well at the time. You just keep hearing this is one of the building blocks in health system, but then not a lot of people actually talked about it. And then I reflected as well, there's so many different initiatives going on in Indonesia, and yet, things are not implemented that well. Why is that? So it has something to do with the way things are governed, the way things are managed. And then I went on to pursue more on that side of things, the governance side of things. And then that led me to the project where I met Mars. That was a project funded by USAID at the time, and they were actually implementing that governance to improve service delivery in health and education and businesses. So, I was really happy that I got into that project, but I was looking at it from the research side of things. So wanting to understand more, why things work, why things didn't work, looking at it from the monitoring and evaluation side of things. And then since then, I've always been in the path of doing research, trying to make sure that good research is being produced and that policymakers could use. That's how, I've been in this field for a bit.
Yeah, so you kind of do your own, in a way, forensic research, right? You're digging in using the clues that you have.
Correct. Yeah, for sure.
And I think that I personally find a problem in finding the root of the problem, I feel. Sometimes I take Mars helping me look at a different perspective of the problem to actually find maybe what is the root of the problem that we're seeing here. Because sometimes the problems that we see are just symptoms of an even bigger problem. So what goes through your mind when you kind of do this kind of like research? How do you find like the root of the problem?
Yeah, so and that's a really good point, actually, looking at it from different perspectives. And that's exactly my approach so far. I call it like a systems thinking, really, where, I'm looking at a particular problem and trying to apply different kind of lenses and trying to understand that problem. So even if it's a health problem, if it's in the health sector, for example, you have to apply a managerial hat, for example, and trying to understand what is it that is not being managed well in the health sector. Is it the human resource management, or is it something else? And I think that's what I've been using so far. This trying to when I can't put on too many hats because I'm not an expert in every single sector, I try to bring in a lot of different people who would have different expertise and would offer different perspectives and challenge my thinking as well. So, for example, when I was deciding on taking on public health, or even trying to determine that there was actually a problem in the health system itself, I try to talk to as many people as possible and hear out their opinions, people who are more expert in the field compared to me. And then that really got me thinking. And like my job was really to synthesize all this information that I had and thought, oh, okay, like looks like here are the root cause of the problem, like asking the different 5 whys, the different levels that got you to the root causes, I think. And what about you guys? You in your different fields. Yeah, you in your different fields. What do you see? Like, how do you figure out what's the root cause of your problem that you see?
I feel like this is more of a Mars question, because for me, science is pretty strict. In biology, it's a bit more straightforward, right? If you see a problem, especially if you're in microbiology, right? You see a problem, you sample it, and you found a problem. But then it's
That's so straightforward. Well, I've been also in system thinking, especially a lot of my classmates are planners now. Well, not now, going to be. I did also an internship where we actually work with grassroots groups. So a lot of the thinking I did when it comes to a problem is where is the momentum of the problem? Because what's interesting about the internship I did in that place was the idea is that the problem is already identified. It's just that there is no way for them to advance that problem. So it's figuring out if there's other more momentum happening in the problem, and if there are people who will work onto it so that people are supported rather than like intervention coming out, because that's not always what's needed. Like service delivery is great, but sometimes it doesn't like solve the issue. Sometimes you just kind of need that push, like you need that support because they already know what the problem is. That's like what what I'm thinking about right now, especially going into like a thesis year. What do you think? Yeah.
But then that brings out the different question then, because you're dealing mostly with people, right, in your research. So how do you ethically handle it then? Like, how do you collect data? How do you interact with the locals? And is the interaction like different with local regions maybe? So how do you approach them?
Right. Yeah. For my job, definitely, I had to do a lot of that where I had to go out to the field, different areas, and meeting a lot of different respondents that I had to interview. And the main principle that I try to uphold in doing all these research is the do no harm principle, as well as treating people, with as much respect and dignity, as much as we can. Just because it's, you're talking to people and you want to make sure that you treat them the way you also want to be treated. It's that same principle, and always assess whether our research project, has any risk. I think there's always a risk, and different projects will have different levels of risk, from low to high risk. And it's our job as researchers to ensure that we minimize the risk as much as we can, and coming up with the mitigation strategy. So, for example, I've had to work with children on a very sensitive topic, and as a researcher, I also had to make sure that the team had a response plan. And what that means is, if we ever come across issues with children experiencing, let's say, violence, we need to make sure that it's being properly followed up. And like, what is the proper channel like? And how do we make sure that, the data that we collect are actually safe and it's not actually causing any more harm to our respondents? And if we're assessing that and we come to the conclusion that yes, our research is actually going to be dangerous for our respondents, then hold back, take a step back and then change the research, and then ask again, do we really need to do this research, and why do we need to include these vulnerable populations in our research? How is their participation in the research going to contribute? What is so unique about this research? So like there is a lot of thinking going into my mind whenever I do this, and I also want to make sure that it's not just doing research for the sake of doing research. I try to think a lot about the kinds of value that we can bring to the policymaking world, especially like how are policymakers going to use it? How am I going to make sure that the data collected are actually going to be used for a good use to improve their lives? Even if changes happen later on, may not be in my lifetime, but at least that kind of thinking, helps me figure out like the best way possible, given the circumstances, to conduct this research safely. And that actually brings me to my question, like you guys are actually doing research too. I know you're doing it in the lab, but like what kinds of thinking, that goes into your mind when you have to do research in biology?
I feel like with biology, these kind of questions come into play when you're looking for funding. Because when you're looking for funding, then the people who fund your project want to know what's the use of doing this kind of research, right? And I've learned, because for some reason my dissertation professor wanted me to write my dissertation in the format of a research proposal. UK research proposals have this section called impact summary. So they want you to list out what are the potential, like who can benefit from this kind of research, and like what is the benefit of this kind of research. And that allowed me to take things from a different perspective, because based on my knowledge, there is a gap between the knowledge of academia and what's applied in the real world, right? In academia, there's so much information coming in and out. There's so many different like electronic appliances being produced, new technologies, different methods. But then there's still like a boundary between that and what's applied in the real world. And I feel like that needs to be assessed. And it's not something that most scientists think about, because most of them think lab work, here's the funding, and then you do your research. But then when you start talking to other people, then you start getting that extra level of, oh, well, why is this a problem in the first place? And like, how's it different in different areas? And so my research was on a vaccine that can be produced in developing countries. And I talked to Mars about it, and she gave me a different perspective on it, because she was telling me about healthcare accessibility in countries like Chad. And that was really an eye-opener, and it really like changed the overall scope of the project, and then how important that can possibly be, and what are the problems, because this is a vaccine that can be produced for people who need it, but for some reason it's not a technology that's being applied in the real world. So what is that boundary? And taking that new perspective to solve the question really helps, because most of biology is a little bit more straightforward than that, right? The most complex part about biology research is figuring out the biology, but aside from that, it's
you make it sound so easy.
It's not easy, but people don't realize how interdisciplinary it is, right? They don't realize how many other factors come into play. And yeah, so how about you, Mars?
Well, in the planning field itself, it's very similar with policy making, right? You don't want to token a certain race, especially if it's like a community that's very diverse, and there's like people who are marginalized and don't know how to talk. So in planning itself, you need to know how to kind of like be fair in a certain way. Especially in my thesis, you need to figure out, so I don't know what my research is going to be, but it's definitely going to be about like grassroots groups and how they make city decisions, So I have to think about which grassroots groups am I going to like interview and like talk about, and like what about those who don't get the position of being that influencer to the city, and why is that? So like knowing that there's like so many spectrums that is not as clear cut as biology, because like even when you do those things right, sometimes it does, if you don't write it correctly, it doesn't come out right. So just knowing that you take the different perspectives, but you also like do it well.
Yeah, for us, risk assessment also is more literal in a sense of like this microbe. How dangerous is it to me and to the people around me? And the chemicals that I'm using, how dangerous is it? So it's not so much like who are the vulnerable populations or not. It's more like the things that we're dealing with. How can they possibly affect us negatively, biologically? So
I mean, in planning, there's also this thing like how do you invite people? That's actually, I think, the most hardest part in this, because like essentially we also do research, but like getting vulnerable populations really hard, especially like when we talk about immigrants, why don't they vote, or like when we don't talk about why do women not come, maybe because like there's no childcare, so they can't like share their opinions. So like I think that's an important part in planning, but like I don't know if you have any answers how to do that. That's
public
been an
engagement
age.
is hard. Public engagement is hard. I feel like even without all those problems, I don't like filling out surveys and forms.
Yeah, I mean, people don't even like, doing like post-its, because like that's also sometimes tokenism, right? Because they're like, oh, look at all these pretty post-its, like all my ideas, and then they're like, oh, I just want to look pretty, and then this one idea. It's a very like mind-boggling thing.
Yeah, no, I feel you for sure. Like that happens to me too. Like when I do research, how am I making sure that we also have those, right? Like these pretty post-its. After we do focus group discussions and all that, like that's very common in social research too. Like how do we make sure that the data utilization part is actually being done properly too? Definitely that's a challenge, and I don't think we have like the answer for that. But we all try our best. Like I think from what you guys said too, like this, ethical thinking really, and that's like value-based leadership. I think that's what's super important in like the different work that we're doing for sure.
Yeah. So what are some social issues that can possibly affect health systems then?
There are many different things for sure. Let's say if we're talking about access to health, people's indigenous status is one. I think where they are located geographically, and the way they live their life as well, just a different lifestyle. It seems like so different from the rest of us, from the majority, and yet it becomes the structural barrier for these people to access healthcare, for example. Like if they have a certain belief, our system just excludes these people instead of trying to understand, where they're coming from, or why they're doing the things that they're doing, and how can the state or the country provide services to them, rather than making it even more difficult for them to access healthcare. That's from the indigenous community, and I think it's something that, though I've never really like worked on like the indigenous community access to healthcare, but it's something that I read a lot about, that I come across, and it just makes me think all the time, like how are we supposed to reach to them? It's not only about applying the mindset where like, oh, we already have these services going, they should be coming to us. It's not really about that. It should be a two-way thing. From like the state's perspectives, I think. So far, like those are some of the things that I'm thinking. I don't know. What about you guys? Like that you see could be a challenge in accessing healthcare?
Ooh, that's a lot. Like I did a lot of health geo, right? So I know kind of a bit. Like a problem would be when a country comes in for aid for like, it's like a pandemic, so they come with a vaccine, but then they don't provide sustainable funds or some kind of way they can sustain that, that help, that actually like endangers the population, because it's like they're holding on to, like, it's like a parental figure, and when it's gone, it's losing their magic. Lost my train of thought. When they're gone, then they can't support financially, especially financially, and mostly like equipment wise cannot support the thing that they've already done. And as a general population, people get really confused, right? Because you've already done this, and then you can't do it anymore with like another people. I think that's a big issue. And then what else have I learned? It's mostly the system, right? Because sometimes if you don't have certain stuff, it takes you longer to like sign up stuff. The thing I forgot about, so Jakarta, for example, has the Jakarta Health, whatever, Jakarta Card Health.
Kartu Jakarta Sehat.
Which
Yeah.
is like, yeah, there you go. Oh my god, I'm right. Which is really helpful, to be honest. Like, I've heard a lot of stuff about like people getting free surgeries and like all that. But the problem is for older people or like for people who can't fill in forms, that's a huge problem because a lot of the system is about filling forms and like getting it to the right people. And once they're done with that, it's like it's all great. But then like we didn't figure out about like what about people who are disabled or like people who can't fill forms? Do they have to have people around? What if they're like alone and they don't have any family anymore? I think that's a issue that we don't think about because we always think about let's get the vaccine, but then like what about implementing the vaccine? What about after the whole AIDS stuff? What do you do after that?
Yeah. For me, one of the things that I've realized is a barrier is how new the technology is, can really influence how less privileged areas are willing to take in that technology because they don't have the money to invest in a technology that doesn't really have many products on the market, which is a problem because, so I read a journal paper that basically is molecular farming for low-income countries. And so they're talking about producing vaccines or other medical products in plants, which should be okay for less developed countries because they have that capacity to grow a lot of plants. The issue is their governments don't have as much money and they have to consider like, am I willing to invest my money in a technology that is not proven yet? And it just ends up slowing down progress because this technology was built to produce pharmaceuticals for low-income countries, but low-income countries don't want to support it because they can't afford to, because it is a high-risk thing to do, to support a technology that doesn't have many products. And in return, it just makes the process a lot slower. And most of the stuff is mostly what Mars says. Like a lot of countries, they would bring like altruistic programs, like MSF, Doctors Without Borders. They would come into countries, they would provide aid, and then they would leave. But then what happens once that aid like disappears? The impact that it has on the society can be really negative, because one of the papers that I read was that people become dependent on things like injections without actually any need for them. So the polio vaccine, for example, you can take orally, so you can just take it, you can just ingest it. Essentially, it's on your tongue. I remember it tastes good. I don't know why, but
yeah, it's sweet. You're right. I remember that too.
How do you guys know this? Okay.
Because it's the only vaccine that did not require a jab, and
Exactly.
it's problematic because like we're close to eradicating polio. Essentially, they just recently announced that we've eradicated polio from Africa, which is like a big accomplishment. But the problem is when people are not that educated and they don't understand how vaccines work, they think that medicine requires an injection. You get an injection and you're cured, or an injection and then you're protected. But because of that, you're wasting a lot of medical supplies because you need the people end up just injecting, like, let's say saline, because really you don't need that injection. So there's a lot of useless injections being done. So there's a lot of bio waste that's being created. There's that risk of bloodborne infections. And that's mostly like a side effect of foreign aid coming in, right? Which is quite difficult, yeah.
Because like they still have the problem, you know, it's not gonna go away when they go away too, right? Also,
Yeah.
Sometimes there's these stereotypes, like the stereotype of planning, if you think about planning or like policy or like just planning policy, I guess, it's like that guy with a mic who like, oh yeah, I think there's a problem in like our bathrooms, it sucks, you know, but like you don't have to do it like that. That's like very, first of all, marginalized people can't do that because like, come on, they can't just come on stage and talk. It's just like those stereotypes that really hurts about how like social change should be, because we think such a, I don't know, like a box. I don't know. What do you think?
Something about like what you guys said that was really interesting, and what Michelle said about technology, for example. Technology definitely, is a big hit right now everywhere, including in the development sector. People are like, okay, just create this app and then we'll be set. Unfortunately, it's not really how it should work, right? It should be about like technology as a means and not an end. And that too brings, I think my attention as well to how we design programs. Like it can be technically, what do you call it? Like technically solid. Like, that that's exactly the thing that should be done to address the solution, to address the problems. Like that's the ultimate solution. But at the same time, we often forget that there's also the political dynamics that we need to navigate. So it may not be necessarily politically feasible. And I think that speaks a lot to development projects, right? Like that's why sometimes people think like, oh my God, it's so slow in the development sector. And then you're like, yeah, that's true, because social change takes a long time. Sometimes what we're doing right now in our lifetime is to really lay down the groundwork for the next generations to work on. And like we keep building on everything that like our predecessors has built on, and we're just adding to it. So yeah, something about that like really, I think really reminds me about like the development sector dynamics, the being technically savvy and also just politically savvy at the same time if you really want to achieve impact. And sometimes this impact is not like the ultimate impact that we see. It's like all these incremental changes that happen along the way that will ultimately, hopefully, lead to the impact that we want to see. And then, you both actually also mentioned like the unintended consequences of doing a particular work. You may be doing this kind of training or something, and yet like we're forgetting that actually, yeah, it may actually create a disincentive for the communities that we were actually trying to help. That we kind of create this standard where like, okay, if I go to a health care or like a clinic, I must get injection. If not, then that's not getting treatment. And so like, I think it really is important for us, like, in trying to create social change, to keep thinking what could be potentially the unintended consequences from the solution that we actually try to offer. And I think it also reminds me, it's a note to self that intention is an intention, that it can, you need to make sure that it's actually being translated and implemented well on the ground to say that, yes, we've actually created positive impact. Like, you can just say, oh yeah, my intention was to this, but then, sorry, too bad, it doesn't translate to like that. For example, like you're building a school, but you never train the teachers, or, you don't provide school equipment and you don't engage the children on like what's a good education should be like. What's the use? That was a good intention, but sorry, it doesn't really translate. So I think in like talking about foreign aid and like not only about foreign aid, but like all these things that we think can be socially beneficial, I think it's also very important for us to take a step back and think again, like ask ourselves, like how is this going to benefit the communities in a negative way as well? Like how is it going to impact them? Because that's equally important, because sometimes we tend to like have this lens where we're only looking at the positive side of things and not really about the negative sides, which sometimes we just forget. It just gets overlooked.
Yeah, that phrase of it's the thought that counts, I feel like it only very specifically works for presence. It does not work anywhere else. And like literally, right? We're used to going to, Mars and I are used to going to outreach projects. We go to so many of them. And I myself have done some abroad outreach projects. But the thing that I realize is it's not so much an outreach project, even local ones. It's not so much outreach as it is almost poverty tourism, in which people of more privileged positions go visit a less privileged positioned place. They go there, they feel more grateful about what they have, and then they leave without really doing much. And that happened to me when I went to Nepal. I went to Nepal expecting, I'm going to be placed in a hospital. I'm going to work with doctors, which I don't understand how that works now that I look back, because I have no medical training and there's no guarantee any of the students do. But I was placed in a hospital 6 kilometers outside of the capital. And I know a lot of my colleagues, they came there and they said, I am so grateful for what I have back home. But what you see is years later, none of these kids stay on the path of being doctors. Like a lot of them, some of them go into genetics, others of them go down different courses, but not a lot of them actually stay in medicine. And that just shows like it's not just about the intention. There has to be some practicality behind it. And also when we were there, where exactly did our money go? Because is it just for us to like travel around and like look at people like, oh look, just stand around in the hospital like, oh look, these people are sad and they're poor, and you don't really get to think about how do we help them, how do we create a system that's more sustainable. Instead it just becomes like a tourism thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually. Go ahead, Mars.
Oh, nothing. Like when I moved to our high school, that was the one thing that bothered me so much, because a lot of the projects that they do end up doing was like either you throw money or like you throw this one day where you just like, aha, you know, here's a child with me, whoa. And I was like, seriously, this is what you do? Like, you guys are super rich and this is what you do? I'm sorry, but like I was really annoyed because I was taught that was not the way to do social change, because you're not doing them any favor. You're just throwing them fish and hoping they will like float and like survive with that type of food, right? I mean, going now in masters, I have more deeper like thought about it, like the fact that it's the systems that we should think about. Actually, a good thing my mentor said was, sometimes the good thing about a project is maybe you should just stop it and rethink about it, even if you're far away about it, because like maybe you figure out it doesn't really work. So then you have to think about maybe what are the people I can involve, what are the stuff I can work with that I didn't think about, but really like stopping and not just like, yeah, you know, we'll like fix it after. Because I think a value thing I was instilled now is like prototyping. It's never the end, the final project. It's always like, what are things that are not working and we can do better. Because if we always think about like, this is the best solution for this issue, then we will never figure out maybe a better solution, because we are already stuck in that solution. And I mean, also being like an NGO work all the time, I was really we have an episode on that later, but like I was just really tired of like, you know, the notion that like they are the only one making change, when it's supposed to be like a system of like people coming together. And like universities, for example, they need to be more reliant on the research they do that are including people, and NGOs cannot be the one that is the savior of the system, like the social justice warrior of, you know, social change. That's not never going to happen, because they have to be involved in the system and figure out how to open the system. It's the same with protesting, I guess, right? Because like there is a time where you need to be vocal and like also kind of be like pushy, because like that's not, without that, change doesn't happen yet. But when you're in the, you know, in the period of time where, all right, the system opens, you need to be able to negotiate too, right? Because you're fighting like how much of an age-old system that is already there. And then like you should be like, I'm not saying you should like, you know, like put yourself in and immerse in the system and then like be gone. I'm saying like be bold and like tell them what's wrong, but also be smart about it, I guess.
And I hear of a few different super interesting things from you guys. So firstly, you know, when we do all this work, and like what you and Michelle experience when doing all these like different outreach projects, for example, it sounds like, I mean, it's pretty normal, right, for us to be involved in that kind of project and feel like, oh, I'm really grateful for what I have. I think that's really human and that's okay. But of course, after that, you know, what is really important is to, again, take a step back from I, and then, you know, start thinking about like the rest of the communities that we try to help, and start thinking like, if we're doing a social cause, for example, like, are we hearing their voice, the communities that we're trying to help? Or are we imposing our own thinking of or our perception of their life? And I think a lot of times, you know, we have our biases, and that's that's being human, definitely. And I think we could never get rid of our biases, but we do need to acknowledge our biases and think like, oh, okay, this is how I've been perceiving the poor people, like, and how they live their life. But is it really though? Is it really like what they want? This help that we offer to them, is this what they need? Is this exactly aligned with the kind of lives that they're living? And I think I read a book, no, actually a paper written by Abhijit Banerjee, one of the Nobel Prize winners. He's an economist, about the poor people and how they live their lives. And it's a super rich paper, like taking a look at like how people live their life and why, they are making all of these decisions. It may come across as irrational to some people, and that's why people come with so many different kinds of solutions. But actually, it is rational in their heads. And if we ever want to create a systemic change, it's really also important to put a lens where we're actually trying to understand where they're coming from instead of where we're coming from, and tell them this is the solution and this is going to help you. That's just that's one way of interpreting it. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's also a narrow way of looking at things. And I think it's important for us, to be able to acknowledge that our biases and also our privilege in doing this kind of work. And nothing wrong with that. Like I just want to make sure that like people get this message that we're not trying to say that like, oh, just stop whatever that you're doing, it doesn't work, we're doomed. But rather like, yeah, keep doing what you're doing, but also don't forget to take a step back and reflect. Are we really elevating the voices of those who are unheard, who are excluded in the system? Because essentially the social change I think that we want to create is to use the power that we have, whether it's our privilege, to be able to elevate voices of these people who cannot otherwise like voice their opinions.
Yeah, and I think another like valid point that I saw from Trevor Noah was that we sometimes like to equal our suffering with other people's suffering, and we have that mistake of kind of like making the problems almost like, I don't know how to describe it, we're kind of pushing two people's problems and kind of thinking that they're the same, but then they're not, right? And with that, I think some people make the mistake of thinking that, oh, it works for this, therefore it should also work for this. But then it's more complicated than that, right? There's a whole system connected to like a certain area that like when you think about how to fix a problem, you have to think about all these different factors, and then it really affects the community. And like maybe the social impact as well, the negative impacts that you talk about, they might also be different, right? For different groups and different problems. So it's just something to think about, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The number one in planning is never copy something. Or I've personally thought about, now that I'm like 1 year in, that we should never think solution based, because sometimes if you actually coming from like an education system where you're just like, yeah, think of a solution of this thing, like your thinking should be, how can I like help in a way that you're like giving them a momentum for because like sometimes you already know the issue. I mean, most of the time you actually already know issue, and there's like, I think previously when we met, we talked about like interview fatigue, like when people are like, yeah, we already told you the issue like 100,000th time, like what else do you want us to know? I think that made me think, especially now, and like thinking about like how can you make like planning itself was like actually for like colonial people to keep the city colonized. So like moving away from that and thinking about not solution based, but like momentum based, people based, public interest with an S, because there's no one public interest. And like, yeah, it's mind-boggling, honestly, but it's interesting.
No, absolutely. Those are really, really important points. Like working in a system, right? You're working with a lot of different people with different interests, motivations, and like you said, changing one aspect of a system will affect other aspects down the line, and definitely create different outcomes, whether they're positive or negative. That's making it even more complex. That's why social change takes such a long time. It really is a marathon.
Well,
Yeah.
another question I have for you: how do you stay sane in all this?
No. Because I know there's a part of my life where I'm like, how can I do this? Like I'm seeing people who are like being slaughtered with the system, or like I'm like crying about this one person, and like I sometimes I can't stay sane. How do you do?
That's a really good question, because sometimes I ask myself that too. Like how, like what do I do? And I'm not gonna lie, like working in social change and seeing all these like problems, I've seen this problem like just in a different package ever since my late father was working on it. He was working in the poverty sector, and then here I am, like decades later, like his daughter is continuing the work, I guess, but it sounds still very similar. I talked to my mom, and she's like, that's like what I heard back when your dad was still here. Like, oh, interesting. And so that just shows, right, like how frustrating things can be. And there are a few things that I do to stay sane. It includes working out, meditation, watching movies, but also at the same time, like telling myself that, really reminding myself over and over again. And this happens like every time, constantly, that social change really is not gonna happen like tomorrow. And the fact that because it's a system, we can never attack a particular spot in the system, like the core, even if we know the root cause of the problem, because it's a system, like you said, it's just complex. It's a given or inherent nature of being in a system. So there's this piece that I will always remember from the Poor Economics book by Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. But they were saying that changes actually happen at the margin. And this is exactly that we're doing, right? Like everybody from different sectors, different angles, try to leave the world, a better place from, yesterday. And knowing that, like, I'm not the only one responsible for creating this massive change, because I will never be able to. And I know, like, there are people like you guys who also care. And I have a lot of friends too who care about this kind of work. That actually gives me hope. Like, it actually takes or lifts some burden off my shoulder as well. Sometimes we're like, we tend to feel a bit lonely as well in doing this kind of work. But know that you are not. And there are actually people out there as well working on a very similar issue in a very challenging environment as well. And we can always talk too. I think it's also important to stay connected with people who are in this kind of sector and talk it out, like, our frustrations, what's going on. There are days when I just reserve for complaining before I finally get back to, like, okay, like, breathe and then take a step back and then start again, taking one day at a time. And it really is just like you need to rest as well, right? We can never make this like a continuous fight. We can never do that. I'd rather think about it this way, from like a healing perspective almost, rather than fighting, because that's really tiring. So that's like the way I stay sane. I don't know. What about you guys? What do you think? Like, when you're frustrated, looking at all these things that are happening in the world, how do you stay hopeful?
We have therapy sessions.
I don't. We have a very small, close-knit group where we kind of vent our frustrations. And it's very interesting because all of us come from different backgrounds. So all of us take a different perspective, and then we tackle the issue, and they're very understanding. And I think, like, that's an important part, right? To have friends that understand. And they're not trying to fix your problem. They're just trying to understand. And when you feel seen and understood, it does help.
Yeah, no, definitely. My cohort is, I keep saying this, they are like the most wonderful people on earth. It's because we were the first cohort that are very diverse. There's so many opinions that I never thought about, and people who know they're people know they're privileged say it. Like, it's not like, they're very open and like talking, and like very almost like tight knit. So I'm really comfortable in like having these people who are just very open minded. I think that's very rare, especially now. Maybe more in Asia, where everything's a competition, and like once you spill yourself, you're like, once you show a weakness, they're like, I think I'm really thankful for working in a cohort that's very just working together based. Like it doesn't matter what grade you are. Like we come from a system that is highly sometimes racist, sometimes discriminatory. Like that doesn't mean that none of us are smart. It's just that we all come from different point of view and we all express differently. That was like my opening extra first year of my life that I finally was like, yeah, sometimes you just can't figure out, but you know, at least you have people who like you can open up with.
Yeah. So I guess that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much, Andini, for coming on and teaching us your ways.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
this was really nice.
Thank you for it's night there, so thank you for coming. I always thought you were really cool when I was a lone high school student interning, and I'm just really glad to have you here. And you tune in for another episode next week. And
awesome.
Yeah, see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello, hi. Thank you for listening to the Peak Boredom Podcast. This is Mars and Inga signing off, and don't forget to tune in next week. Please. Bye.